Hello and welcome to Breaking Culture Live. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews, and I'm your host. I'm the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm broadcasting from Chicago. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Mike Hill, Brad Evans, and Chantal Meza to speak about the emergent transformations in warfare, the ways it has disappeared or exceeded humanity, and the ways the arts and humanities can respond. Mike Hill is professor of English at the University of Albany, SUNY. He is currently his current research is in the field of ecological humanities, particularly issues of genre change, realism, and climate fiction. Hill has written on the relationship between war and culture, the non-economic writing of Adam Smith, U.S. race relations and whiteness, and public sphere theory. He's authored or edited several books, most recently and relevantly, the book On Posthuman War, Computation and Military Violence, and his current book in progress, Ecologies of War, which is sort of a follow up to that book, focuses on climate change, ecological realism, and contemporary forms of political violence. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for helping put this panel together, Mike.
Thank you very much, Sean. Good to be here, and thanks for organizing this as well.
Brad Evans is professor of political violence and aesthetics at the University of Bath, United Kingdom. He is the author of 20 books and edited volumes, along with over 150 academic and international media articles. Brad has written extensively on the state of international affairs while having made a number of telling theoretical contributions to the understanding of violence. For the past decade, he's largely been working on the violence of disappearance and the importance of transdisciplinary responses. Brad regularly makes television appearances in global broadcast audiences, including televised interviews with BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and TRT World. Throughout 2015 to 2017, Brad led a dedicated series of conversations on violence with leading critical thinkers for the New York Times opinion section, a conversation he continued to cultivate at the Los Angeles Review of Books and now the American Book Review, where he serves as an assistant editor. Really glad to have you with us, Brad.
Yeah, it's great to join you. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to Mike for putting it together as well.
And finally, Chantal Meza is an acclaimed Mexican painter based in the United Kingdom whose work practice focuses on the human as seen through various forms of disappearance. Her work is held in public and private collections around the world, and over the past 15 years, her paintings have featured in exhibitions and biennials in prominent museums and galleries in Mexico, United Kingdom, Paraguay, and Germany. Having delivered international lectures and workshops at reputable universities such as Harvard, École Normale Supérieure, and Goethe Universität. In 2025, she was appointed Artist Impact and Engagement Fellow at University of Bath in the UK. Her State of Disappearance collection is now permanently on display at the university's Chancellor's Building, having been gifted following solo shows of the works in Bristol and London. Most recently, her exhibition Absence was showcased at the Embassy of Switzerland in London at an event partnered by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the British Red Cross. She is the author of many articles and co-editors of the books State of Disappearance and Disappearance of Worlds. Chantal is currently artistic director for the Review of Education, Pedagogy, and Cultural Studies, and she's also working on her next solo exhibition, A Natural History of Violence, to be exhibited at the gallery Capillera de Arte in Mexico. So grateful to be in conversation with you as well, Chantal.
Yeah, same, Sean. Thank you very much. Michael as well.
So as I was reading through all of your work, or as much as I could, I kept having this feeling of disorientation in time and space, because so many of the concepts and the emergent cultural formations you're speaking about appear to be either newly relevant in the Trump era or the like of an earlier era and no longer relevant. We kind of surpassed them, or maybe we've gone to an era before. But one place I was especially struck by this was in the section in Posthuman War, Mike, where you're talking about the Gates Doctrine, which advocates for the inclusion and racial diversity of the military alongside partnering with the university system, which is then seen as sort of like a valuable enterprise of intellectual contribution. And in that section, you're elaborating on the kind of insidious biopolitical breakdown of the divisions between civilian and military life. But now the military is being run by what appears to be the most meat-headed racist that they could have chosen, who is now insisting that all male soldiers over 30 get testosterone testing and
Yeah.
treatments. And while there's certainly something post-human about gender-affirming care in general, I don't think that's what you meant. So uh,
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to, I don't know, just as an opening question, what has shifted? Do you feel a shift, or is this a continuity, or both?
Right. No, I appreciate the question, and I'll try not to go on too long because it's a very big question, and I want to make sure we get some of these questions about temporality and human experience and the loss of what it means to be human in a certain sense of that term from Chantal and Brad's perspective as well. What you were referring to is the Gates doctrine has to do with this thing that military professionals still refer a lot to, which is called the revolution in military affairs. And it's at that point in the sort of post 9/11 era where data it becomes really hugely important. And not that it wasn't important before. I mean, information has always been a certain kind of war material. But what we mean by this, when they talk about bullets, beans, and data being the big three that we're going to need to focus on in the revolution military affairs, means entering into what they call full spectrum warfare, which means that every aspect of human relationships, including the human body, is now what they call an area of operation, or at least potentially an area of operation. So the posting of the human takes place with this expansion of the battlefield into places that typically weren't described or operable in that way. And so that's where this term also that I use in the book, de-civilianization comes through. So we're seeing a move. I think the change would be the move from a civil society model where violence is kept, at least theoretically, more or less exterior to operations of communicating. Habermas's old hobby horse of communicative reason, free and interested open debate, the use of private reason in a public way, all those wonderful things of liberal democracy, I'm arguing, have been displaced by this expansion of the terrain of war. But how quickly things change and how quickly they stay the same. I mean, when revolutions happen, let's just use that term from the RMA, Revolution in Military Affairs. I mean, one of the things that happens too, and this is maybe a more theoretical point about time, change in the present changes the way in which we think about the past. And so we begin to see things in the past that we didn't see before. And those things either become forerunners that we never knew about. I mean, this is a point Benjamin makes as well in the thesis on the angels of history, or there become continuities, and there become continuities between past and present that we hadn't quite figured out. So there's ways in which that absence that we see in an archive, because archives are very, very vast and they're big things and they contain perhaps even infinite amount of possibility. And the ways that we connect to them depend upon our situation in the present. So I would argue, yeah, that there is a big change. The revolution in military affairs is real and it's ongoing. But the sort of snapback, between the uses of demography in war, which sees all racial categories as fluid, or at least operationalizable, and that they can
Yeah.
be manipulated and put to service of violence and so on, that is in the Gates doctrine, slips very quickly, very easily, almost seamlessly into the kind of nationalism and racism that doesn't seem to mesh very well with the highly relativized version of identity that you see in the earlier phase of the RMA. And yet, both are deeply nationalistic and violent enterprises. They have that in
Right.
common. And to that extent, they work hand in hand.
Well, I want to come back to this, but like you said, I want to make sure we also talk about the, the the work that Brad and Chantal are doing, and one of the, and I kind of have a similar question just to kind of open the ground, because as I was reading the introduction to the State of Disappearance, and even before you got to the section where you talk about Juarez, I was thinking about Juarez as being one of the epicenters of disappearance, particularly of women, of femicide. Um, but now the U.S. has set up this concentration camp on the other side of that border, near El Paso. This serves as a new site of disappearance for the U.S. government. And so perhaps another way of, a framing question for that is, in what way, entering into all of your work, what is this moment doing to throw that work into a different relief? Um, you know, we now have a different kind of disappearance at work in the U.S.
Well, maybe I can start with some of the history, and I think it's interesting to point out just in terms of we could talk about chronology, but chronology in itself is very fragmented, I think, as Mike just pointed out. And I think, first of all, when the news breaks about the disappearances in Juarez, and I think Juarez, the violence there has to be situated alongside NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and how that violence in that kind of borderland space accelerates. The moment particularly, in 1994, 95, where the violence in Juarez starts to become media attention, of course, is the same time as the Zapatista uprising, but also is the same year where Aquila and Ronfeld publish Networks and Net Wars out of the Rand Corporation. And this book is very influential over the revolution in military affairs as well. And interestingly, if you go back to Networks and Net Wars now, the opening chapter of that book is basically plagiarized Deleuze and Guattari. The war machine and the narrative of Go, which they basically almost read right back verbatim. And they just basically lift Deleuze and Guattari and they just throw it back and this becomes, this point that, that Hart and Negri make in Empire, if you have really something meaningful and radical to say, power's never going to ignore you, it's going to appropriate you. And in that sense, Deleuze and Guattari become very much appropriated in that revolution in military affairs. A lot of their ideas become, militarized and so on. Now, and I think alongside that, it's not short after as well that Bill Gates writes his book, Business at the Speed of Thought. And there's actually a remarkable chapter in Gates' book on Business at the Speed of Thought, where he basically is a chapter on the military. And what he's really talking about is basically killing at the speed of thought. This is a remarkable moment in terms of when you think about then, and this is back about then continuity and disruption, yes. And I think Paul Virilio obviously gets this, right? Virilio's idea on speed. And I think this idea of, the speed of violence. But then I think, where we kind of then get up into the present moment and you talk about what's new and what's happening in terms of the context of disappearance, I don't think none of that can also be divorced from Mike's point about the archive, because one of the things I think, one of the misconceptions around disappearance is almost like the absence of people is linked to the absence of knowledge. People who disappear have historically been the most known and surveyed bodies. And I think the more then, and that's why it's in many senses, it's, the point me and Chantal make in this forthcoming book around the normalization of disappearance. Disappearance now takes place in the open. It's no longer a hidden, dirty secret like it was in the 1970s. And actually, one of the contradictions is in the age of surveillance, it's easier to disappear human life because the archive is far more powerful. And I think Derrida understood this with the idea of archival violence. So I think then in that sense, what we're emerging in terms of the idea towards, and I know, hopefully we'll come on to this about the way in which the human itself is put into crisis now. What we are seeing today in that shift from the human to the post-human is precisely the proliferation of new forms of violences, which author new forms of disappearance, which actually make it all the more possible. So I think that's quite a bit of a genealogy to.
Well, yeah, I think I also, as a painter, as an artist, I've been very much thinking about from Mexico when the war on drugs, or the so-called war on drugs, which I was born in. And like many other artists, many other people and civilians, we saw a shift of, especially what Brad is mentioning as well, in disappearances. That was just something that throughout 20 years, it became anybody could disappear. So this violence, as a painter, it interests me how the body became so violated. Anybody, children, women, men, anybody could be used. The body was no longer almost like there was no border. I mean, you were just exposed. You were just in the street exposed. You were walking alongside the army, alongside the police, and nobody. There is this lack of protection. You're just basically thrown in a war that's anywhere. So everything can become, and it became in Mexico. That is a space where it was the violence was there. So I guess visually for me, trying to understand disappearance, or this form of disappearance through abstraction, was I suppose, an interesting shift, because it's basically something which is not visible. So the abstract is visible. You can sense you are in there. You can sense your body is a political subject, that you are. Myself, I'm a woman, so I'm subjected to a particular type of violence. If you're a young man, then you will be subjected to a specific type of form of disappearance. So I think as a painter, it was interesting for me to shift to the abstract and understand the abstraction through that sense. Perhaps we're going to go to that in terms of temporality, that you're talking about, the temporal. How do you actually live life? So because it has no, of course you are living in a specific time, but it also disrupts that temporality. It is a past, it's the present. Where are you exactly situated in this current moment, political moment? I think it's just very it's been very interesting, but also how it becomes part of the neuro violence. It's not just So maybe we can shift to that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and so I mean, and running through there, I mean, there's a question here that I was going to ask later, but I think this is a good way of kind of entering into it, which is this tension and kind of what you just said, Brad, about, which is curious. I don't want to open that up or break it down a little more to say that it's easier to disappear someone in an atmosphere of surveillance, because one of the things that I see running through, the tension between sort of what your work, Mike, and then the question of disappearance in Brad and Chantal, is this tension between the state trying to make us more visible through these computational logics, right? All of these different data points that make us much more visible, and we kind of feel like at all times. I mean, certainly when I speak with young people or students, that the idea that you have anything like privacy is a fantasy, or it's a phantasm. That I don't know. There's no such thing. Everything is public. And then this idea of that the state can also make us less visible through the act of disappearance. So, I mean, on the one hand, I'm curious about how surveillance makes it easier to disappear, and maybe that's how it is easier, is that we are also inured to being surveilled, that we don't notice how easy it is to be disappeared.
Yeah, I really like what you say, and I do want to comment quick and maybe pivot and tee one up for Chantal, because I'm very interested in what the question of art and aesthetics brings to this conversation. It's something that I am not as familiar with as I would like, although that unfamiliarity seems really refreshing and full of possibility. The political part of it, the war tactics part of it, the theoretical part of it, and so on, I feel pretty comfortable with. But there seems to be something really striking and important about this definition of disappearance, right? Which is a very specific kind of disappearance. I mean, we're not talking about absence in some pat or facile form. We're talking about disappearance and absence as a very particular kind of presence. And so how to access and how to grapple and how to encounter that kind of presence in a way that both recognizes, this kind of violence, and also, this maybe even is more specific to the question of aesthetics, the importance of representation, right? Which we could just call media, or maybe technology, or maybe also art. I mean, if you think about art as artifice, right, as ways of figuration, that's a conversation we can have in common, both with abstract painting and computational innovation, that allows for lots of possibility, both, important for recognizing the violent part of it all. But I think maybe too, on the flip side, maybe this is where Negri and Hart come in with issues of multitude and so on, possibilities for connecting outside of traditional forms of connectivity, as in civil society forms. Are there possibilities to do so aesthetically, right? So quick definition of disappearance for Chantal and Brad in some of their writing is the weaponization of everything. And that's exactly what I'm talking about in On Posthuman War. But they also talk about disappearance as a kind of presence that they associate with haunting, the haunted state, a ghostly, right? And so the other term I really like from them is there's this sense of absence, of disappearance, but the word that gets used too in some of their writing is this tremendous nothing. I mean, there is some some fulcrum, that's there, that's really hard to access in representational forms. And so maybe this is where Chantal's work comes in, or Brad's theories of aesthetical also comes in. I don't know, I'll pass that along, but it's something I find really, really interesting.
Well, I think, there's so much to unpack here. And as we said at the beginning, we probably need 3 episodes to kind of go through this. But I think there's, and I do think, it's bringing it back to, first of all, to your book, Mike. And I think, I was struck in many ways in which you talk about there's, the idea of the post-human begins. And I think the title in itself is very compelling. And I was, I'm very taken by it in the sense of, there was almost like a kind of giddy liberation around post-humanism when it arrives. And everybody was thinking, and again, very influenced by Deleuze and Guattari. And a lot of it is very rallying against the idea of the human exception, which we know was deeply problematic as the human as the center of the world. And this idea then that, that we could become anything, right? So the becoming animal, the becoming whatever of the human subject, I think it was very generative as an idea. But of course, this thing gets weaponized, and also I think in that sense, what the section in which you deal with, first of all, the shift to human as terrain, but then human as data as well, and the way in which actually they map onto each other, because the way we understand terrains today are also data, right? So, and in that sense, you can see what starts off as a almost like an emancipatory, liberatory idea, authors very quickly a new kind of erasure, where you can erase the human now, even when the body is still alive, right? And I think that to me was, in some senses, the most important lesson from Agamben, right? That actually something happens when the body crosses the threshold, where in some ways the body no longer matters, because I think Homo Sarker is ultimately a book about neuroviolence. What happens when you can kill the human while the body is still alive? And I think, you deal with that in this book, and I think that sense then in which, that move towards human as terrain, or human as machine, or human as plant, or human as datum, all these things now lead to the erasure of the subject. And in that sense, maybe one thing we need to think about is, in some ways, well, what use is even biopolitics today as a category? Have we exhausted that? Or even Deleuze's concept of control, to me, it seems now rather primitive, actually, to the kinds of surveillance technologies we have today. Deleuze's notion of control was still based on an idea of faciality, but we know power is far beyond faciality today. So I think all those old categories have created a new thing. Now, back then to the aesthetic, and I think, this idea, one of the questions I think we were really trying to grapple with is, why has disappearance become so visible today? You can't turn on Netflix or any TV channel without there being, the top thing is about the disappearance of something, the disappearance of humans, the disappearance of communities, so disappearance is now visible, it's normal. You have, the most god-awful film like Emilia Perez winning Oscars, right? So disappearance is popular culture, it's entertainment, because, and one of the things that we were saying, of course, in a world of appearance, there's nowhere left to go but to disappear. Right, and in that sense, then and then back to this point about nothing, that is the primal fear which underwrites all of this. This fear of nothing, being nothing, your appearance becoming nothing. Now, in terms of the art point, I think Chantal will be able to answer this better. But one of the things I do get from, and I still retain is hasn't been explored enough with Deleuze, and I think it's a very clear message which comes out in his book on Francis Bacon, is the abstract in thought is the thought of resistance. And we haven't fleshed that out enough. And I think that's where the art, Morton's point about, art is resistance from the future. I do think that there is something in that needs fleshing out more. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's important that we've been talking about this idea of how to see. Is it like we see so many images that we have lost our eyes, basically. We don't know how to see, not only the eyes, but the capacity to reflect, to be able to reflect, because of precisely this, the speed of thought, the speed of image, the speed of the everyday news. I don't remember how much time you told me the other day that a news item lasts for, I think it's pretty much a day, isn't it? So
16 hours maximum.
16 hours,
and that comes from a major news network. 16 hours is the most the news story, the most awful news story will have 16 hours.
And then this is precisely this idea about disappearance. You get people killing you, people killing every day. You access to it. You constantly, there is a war somewhere. But there is a declared war or an undeclared war. It doesn't matter. This is still happening. It's still people are disappearing. And I think for us it was important to, I guess, analyze this idea about or stop to think about the idea of what is exactly that we're looking at. And can painters, can sculptures, are we just ancient? I don't know. Sometimes it does feel that way. It feels like you just took in a completely different language, because everything seems to be a consumption. To consume the image, to consume an Instagram post of a painting of something, or of whatever image they produce. Like this idea of, I don't know. It seems to me that it has lost any meaning to humans. There is no contemplation there. So the question of aesthetics, and I think it should remain about how to see. And you always talk about what is it that we're looking at. I think it's a really important. We are observing violence. What type of violence? What does that violence mean? And I don't know. I think it is this oversaturation of the world in our hands does makes an impact. I don't think you are able to do. You are not able to comprehend that amount of information. It's just not possible. It's not possible to be able to comprehend that amount of violence either. Yeah. So I think it makes you feel nothing. It makes you feel like you disappeared indeed, because you don't want to see that. You don't want to engage with that. Or if you do, then you're consumed by it. Right. And you just kind of get lost. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's very interesting thing to just dwell on. From the aesthetic point of view.
Yeah, it makes you just want to watch cat memes. So there's a lot of threads to pick up on there, and one of them that I'm also kind of thinking about, like you just said, we don't, it's impossible to sort of comprehend this as humans, and the most recent kind of answer to this is to give that power over to the computers, right? One of the more consequential effects of this revolution in military affairs was the way data is developed to better understand the battlefield, and in that context, it was a more kind of humanities type data that they were kind of talking about, almost using anthropology, using demographics, maybe even using kind of neuroscience, but the idea was to sort of really use these disciplines of the humanities maybe to better understand culture, to better understand civilization. But now we have like Palantir and these other forces of kind of computation, and the demand is really just to take a really, really big funnel and just to throw all the information into it and let the AI sort it out. And I'm wondering, do you see this as a qualitative shift to the quantitative methods, or is it kind of a continuity with what they were doing before?
That's a really great insight, because it is important to point out that the revolution of military affairs and even the phrase bullets, beans, and data, the sort of hyperactivity of places like DARPA and RAND and others to use computation to open up I'll use the military, language, new areas of operation, which would include zones we used to call civil society, whether they're surveillance operations, in a domestic space, or, tracing biomarkers among kinship relations in tribal communities, abroad and so on. Like that demography and anthropology. Of course, this is one of the things about change, is we realize there's continuity. Let's just say originally, war disciplines. I mean, they really were.
Sure.
The guys, wandering around mapping the United States, Meriwether and so on, were, doing early ethnography. If you read their journals, it's quite astounding. They're also, military generals and stuff, right? So, and it's really mixed together, the history of these disciplines and violence and war. Of course, I'm not in any way the first person to point this out, right? So that's different, though, in some ways, at least, in terms of the actual technology, because the military and revolutionary affairs is happening, within the first decade after 9/11 or so, right? So, we didn't wake up one day in our classrooms and go, hey, our form of talking to one another is books, and we are using computers, but then ChatGPT hits the ground running pretty hard around, I don't know what, 2010, 12, 13. So it's later, that AI comes. But as you said, AI is being used on the battlefield now. I mean, I think the headline yesterday was, the admission comes out that Grok is being used for target acquisition, in the current war.
Grok?
Yeah.
That's the
And
worst one to use.
you got some pointers for the Department of War. The point.
Anything but Grok, I would say.
Yeah, well, Palantir and Anthropic and Claude, I think, is the other one
Yeah.
that they're now using. But what we're talking about are just it's if you want to get really like inappropriately generic about it, it's pattern recognition, right? It's a fairly neutral thing. You could use it to find cancer cells and do good things with medical stuff. You can use it to heighten your target awareness and to do something they call compress the kill chain. If you're
Yeah.
interested in temporality and speed, which goes directly back to Virilio and some others that Brad mentioned, you're talking about using, technology and media to be able to, accelerate, in this case, the relationship between seeing a target and its actual destruction. And they are using Deleuze and Guattari for this. I mean, literally, like, I immersed myself with the U.S. Marine Corps for a while just to try to figure some of this out in the same way I did when I did the Whiteness stuff and lived with the neo-fascists in Virginia, and also went to some conferences at West Point, and they're reading Deleuze and Guattari, straight up. I'm talking to U.S. Marine Corps servicemen about Thousand Plateaus, and it's not ironic, although it seems really weird. It's like they're really serious about it, about the military space and all this other stuff that Deleuze and Guattari talk about with the War Machine. It's like all that stuff is real. So just to answer your question, is it a quantitative shift? Is it is it just an extension of what was already there? I tend to see the origins in AI usage in war as directly related to the things I was talking about in that book. And it's also
Mhm.
has to do with this particular state of disappearance. I mean, the disappearance is into the media itself. I mean, the human is in some sense, and again, I can speak very directly about archival examples, absorbed within the machine. I mean, when I was at Paris Island with the Marines, I got to go and hang out around the F-35s, right? And the helmets for those things are many, many millions of dollars. And the reason why is because the human being is sort of there, but it's only there as one circuit node in this flying computer, which is directly hooked up to the human brain. And so the human brain is, and you can fly by thought. You don't have to use your hands. You can look at things and they'll be destroyed in the very act of perception. I mean, this is the way the new military technologies work, whether they're drones loitering over populations and analyzing anomalies in population patterns and then striking in autonomous war, or whether the human being is a prosthetic of the plane or vice versa, right? There's this kind of weird crossover, this sort of dispersal of the human being per se within mediation itself. So that's the scary stuff, right? That stuff like, oh my goodness, this is horrendous. But then there's this other question that Chantal mentioned. I'm just trying to put it very quickly because I don't want to talk too much. Which is like, how does art, aesthetics, or in particular abstract art, to go back to Brad's point about what abstract art can do, how is that put into critical conversation, with the other kind of media that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Where speed, proliferation, absence in the name of presence, which, producing so much information that it disappears really fast. So you can't keep track of a news story beyond 12 hours, no matter how tragic it is. Like that really weird and interesting memory regime that's attached to computational technology in its artificial intelligence form, right? That's something really interesting and new in many ways, at least technically, but it's an extension of some old things. We realize that. And then to Chantal's point, which just strikes me again is so worthy of continued exploration, right? Here is this thing called abstract art, which is paint on a canvas in this sense. And how does that speak back or in relation to another technology. And I know I'm using technology and media and art, in ways and try to put it together to produce some sparks, But that's where I think Chantal's work comes in, and Brad's theorization of aesthetics also comes in. I don't know if that makes sense to either of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know whether the big issue here is about how comfortable technology is for humans, how comfortable a computer is for humans, how comfortable we are with our phones, how comfortable we are behind the screens. And I think that's very important. And I'm saying this because how comfortable it is to be standing on with a headset and kill someone. Remove the set, and that's it. You are just in a beautiful scenery looking at whatever you're looking at. So how comfortable, how much damage, that comfort we have found as human beings through the screen has make or create its own, obviously his own horrible violence that we are creating. And the physicality of another human here with you, how uncomfortable that is for many people, many young people.
Yes.
We all live through it. You have to be uncomfortable. You have to be sweaty in the presence of someone. You have to just dare to speak in public. And those uncomfortable settings, that uncomfortableness of being in front of someone and be aggressive to that person in their presence, is not is being erased by our own comfort zone. So I think we are perhaps seeing that now how comfortable it is to just scroll to 1,000 images online of artworks, whatever artworks these are, and that comfortable, and then just being empty, and how much the physicality of something that's being produced can give us, whether you like it or not, or some, you might be able to see whatever scenery you see, whatever artwork you encountered, and we all have felt, I dare to say that we all have felt that there is one piece, there is one city, there is one structure, there is one concept, there is something that has make you feel alive, and we have just as probably, I don't even know how that might sound for many people, but as dreamy as whatever, I think we are losing that, and by losing that, we're losing, I don't know, so much intelligence. We're losing our capacity to actually communicate, which is something we want to do. I still think that this feeling of wanting to talk, to communicate, to write to someone, to look at what they're looking at, to be gossiping in their private lives. I think we'll do that regardless. So we do that in not only when online is obviously more accessible, but we have this curiosity, and I think that curiosity and that imagination, and then the sparking of being outside, just living, is really damaging societies and human beings. Yeah,
that strikes me as counterintuitive, but I don't know if you or Brad could help me with this, because it seems really the counterintuitive part seems the most valuable part somehow. That, let's call it non-figurative artwork or abstract painting, that, like, the kind of armchair version of that is, well, it's just abstract and therefore non-connected to reality, and it could be anything or nothing. I would, that kind of thing. Like the worst form of realist critique of abstract art you can imagine, that misses the point. But what I'm hearing is that it's that the mode of experience and viewing, right, of the non-figurative object, which is to say the thing which is not an object at all, or at least not one that's perfectly formed in a way that's adequated to my subject position, right? Like that is really kind of counterintuitively, it does return us in some way, or is return the wrong way, or it does engage us with it being embodied, or with some larger than real reality, or something like that, larger than realist reality. Is that where I'm trying to go? In other words, there's something about abstraction as a mode of aesthetic that I see in your work, and I read in Brad's writing and in your writing as well, right? Where there's like this really critically key conversation going on between modes of perception, that has real relevance to these technological changes. But as you just said, this is a really old form of art, that we're talking about. And yet it
Sure.
seems really relevant and new to me in some way, or as something new to offer in the current context of all the other modes of representation that we're struggling with. I don't know if that.
I think it's
Well,
a really interesting point in a sense of, the way in which, first of all, realist depictions go. And I think a lot of media theorists understood this a long time ago, that the more things we impress that they are the real, actually they become unreal, and it's interesting. We watched a documentary recently on video footage around news broadcast coverage around the Vietnam War in, the late 1960s, early 70s. And the ways in which the news depictions of that war were far more horrific than anything you would ever experience today on television. And actually, one of the things you look at, like the coverage of Iran or Ukraine, is the utter absence of bodies. Right? You don't see that violence anymore. And in that sense, what passes for the real is actually more and more of a simulacrum. Right? So the real has become this terrain. And it is interesting also because, we recently just got back from Florence and we gave a lecture linked to the Mark Rothko exhibition. And Rothko I think is the start of many kind of shifts in terms of appreciation. And I think what I get from, the links between Rothko's work and particularly with Chantal's work is it doesn't give you immediate answers. You can't stand in front of a Rothko or in front of Chantal's work and get it in 3 seconds. It requires you to slow down, and it is all about temporality. And in order to
and spatiality too. I feel like there's something really important about whether you're talking about. I haven't been in the presence of one of Chantal's works, but I've been to the Rothko Chapel. I've seen Rothko's works, and the scale of those works, the feeling of being in front of them puts you. It's hard to not be. If you're going to get something out of that experience, you're going to be put back in your body. You're going to be put back into the space. You're going to know that this was, a thing in the real world, right? And that spatiality also seems important there. And I don't want to interrupt, but I was kind of thinking back to something that Chantal said a few minutes ago about the speed and the news and the abstraction, because I was thinking about these images or the videos of the Defense Department destroying the boats in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And these images that are distributed in social media and often they're put to like soundtracks or something sometimes. So, but either way, it what you just said, Brad, about there not being bodies, it is a very abstract most of the time, right? And really, the only time that we had this sort of the punctum, I guess, of that moment was when there was video footage of people trying to, who survived one of those assassinations, right? And that's when suddenly it became news again. Was when there were bodies or people who weren't yet bodies who were struggling to get on the boat, and then there was the double strike. So I don't know. Anyway, so that makes this contrast with actual abstraction, I think, all the more kind of profound, because these images of people dying become these little abstract blips on your smartphone screen where you just kind of see what looks like a ghostly boat blowing up, and then it's just gone, and we're just supposed to celebrate the absence.
Right.
Well, yeah, I just think, linking on what your point, I agree in a sense of, one of the brilliant things about abstract art is the way in which, when it's done well, is precisely that link between the body. I think Rothko captures a wound in time. He really does that, but also in a way that it's also atmospheric. There's an atmosphere that's linked to the spatiality of it. Now, also, one thing I would say, I do think it's important, perhaps without laboring too much, but to mark a separation between the abstract and abstraction. And I think the abstract, as I understand it precisely, is this creative potential which can go either way, right? So but in that sense, the abstract is precisely that creative potential which starts from nothing, but comes into the world and brings something new into the world. Abstraction, I believe, is the governance of that power, and in that sense, also when you think about disappearance is a subtraction. So we subtract more and more of the human. So, and I think like ideas around sovereignty are an abstraction. Ideas around justice or even humanity can be an abstraction. So I think abstract is the singularity, which, and I'm not talking about the singularity in a technological sense, but in a deeply poetic sense. And I think that difference between abstract and abstraction, and then the subtraction, I think, is important in terms of how we flesh that out conceptually.
Just quick, I want to try out a little experiment as I try to, in real time, put this together, because I'm not there yet. But like, I'm really appreciating our ability to move between political theory and aesthetic. This is really important to me. And so what I'm hearing you talk about sovereignty or other things in the same breath that you talk about abstract and abstraction, you move so fluidly, Brad, between those realms. I started thinking, okay, if I was to give myself like a college aptitude test version of this, citizen would be to multitude what realism is to abstract non-figurative art, right? I mean, there's a way in which that potentiality, which is the word you use, which is so key in somebody like Hobbes, right, who's writing in Latin using the word potentia. Potentia is a very special kind of power. It's what Negri would call a non-constituted power. It's power that's not constituted. It's sort of Foucault's critique of power being objectified in the hands of the state. This is why he didn't like the word ideology very much, although he perhaps misread Althusser on ideology, but that's another conversation. Where power is fluid, power has potential. It could go either way, right? I mean, the multitude could be really nasty, do terrible things. But it's not the citizenship. It's not the public sphere. It's not reduced to nationalism, state identity, or even fixed notions of racial belonging. So there's something happening in the release of the state's obligation, civil society obligations to its citizenry, which we can mourn and probably should, because it's a very violent thing. But does that also open up possibilities in the way of further and more interesting kinds of abstraction at the political level to possibly recohere in politically more interesting and useful and liberatory ways? And how is that exactly what's happening in this aesthetic tension between non-figurative art and figurative art, right? That to me seems like what I'm hearing, where the resonance is in the various levels of discourse here.
I'll link it to Hobbes, but I'll let Chantal to talk more about the abstract art. I think the Leviathan is such a phenomenal book, for so many reasons, and most of the reasons which political theory doesn't pick up on in some ways. But I think the idea of potential in Hobbes is brilliant. But also I think the way in which Hobbes moves from the abstract to abstraction to techne, I think, is also very crucial. Because in Hobbes, the book is ultimately a book about justice and justice as an abstract idea, and it's there in Hobbes. But then you see, and particularly then the use of the frontispiece to the book, which is the first time we actually have a visual representation of the idea of the body politic, right? So that becomes the abstraction. That is the governance of the idea of the potential of justice. But then, of course, when Hobbes gets into the detail, he talks about sovereignty as being an artificial lung. So sovereignty becomes almost like a prosthetic. It becomes a machine. It becomes, so even within him, you have that shift from the unbridled potential of abstract to imagining this abstraction of the body politic to it becoming a technical enterprise. And all within that one text, it's very much embodied in that, but of course Hobbes is writing in a time where at the start, and Agamben is right on this, at the start of biopolitics. This is the birth of the biopolitical regime, and I think what's different today is in the post-liberal moment now. I think Agamben also pushed biopolitics as far as it can go, and we are in that post-biopolitical moment where, states don't even need to justify what they do anymore in terms of, the war machine carries on anyway. Yes, political regimes change, but in this terrain of neuroviolence, then that doesn't matter. And I think that's where the abstraction then becomes all the more important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting because I do believe that in the abstract, it's just that kind of. I'll try to simplify it, and hopefully it won't ruin it. But is that in between, precisely the moment where you indeed can end up going to whatever place. So
Yeah.
it's almost like hovering there in between. You receive something, there is something there happening, you are in that interpretation and that knowledge and that trying to make sense of things, and there is the abstract. So the abstract is there in a form of potentiality or potentia, or about to burst and be something. So in that sense, the abstract can't. The moment it becomes something, then it is something. So in that sense, it can't be something else, because then if the abstract becomes something else, then it is something else. And that physicality, the realism. For example, I'm going to say something which might sound a bit strange, but one of the painters I admire the most is Rembrandt. So you see, I mean, how could I, an abstract painter, admire someone like him? I think when you are, or whatever other painter that you might admire, you see the potential of the brushstroke. So when you are creating something, you have to understand what type of form you giving to, what type of idea you are giving it to color, to shape. So before that happens, there is a moment, and we know in painting as painters, before that happens, before that technicality reaches its point of creation, you still floating in that abstract, and you leaving the abstract. I mean, for example, music is very technical, right? Like there's a technical ability you have to do, the same with painting and with many arts, but there is always, and the arts always hold the abstract as its core. It cannot exist. So a sound can't exist just in the technicality of it. It holds the abstract within the technicality. So in that sense, I don't see them separated as I wouldn't separate the human itself from all those things which we can't see. Love, the memory, our imagination, really we can't. So there is no separation. We are both, and I think the arts therefore help us see and experience that, I think.
Yeah, great.
Not sure whether I went too long, but
that's good.
Well, that's
something very complex.
Definitely. Well, and there's a lot more to unpack here. I mean, obviously, and one of the other things that I'm kind of noticing here are the distinctions between, and what you just said, Brad, about we're being beyond biopolitics. One of the things that comes up in some of your pieces are, and which we don't hear enough of. I feel like in general is the necropolitics, right? Is that this is the dimension, or this is the register that the sovereign is sort of working in, but it's also that it's not just the state that's doing the necropolitics, right? I mean, one of the things that shows up in a lot of what you both are writing about are the non-state actors, like drug cartels, performing the disappearance, right? And so we have that sort of distinction, and it both of these together kind of make me think, and also the discussion of Deleuze and Guattari, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with this work, but Jack Bradich's microfascism, this concept of microfascism, and the way that these, because he's also using some of these ideas about capacities being sort of mobile, fluid, and then kind of congealing around these sorts of forces of necropolitics or of death, which I'm not sure where that fits with abstraction or with the humanities, but it does seem like there is a cultural force right now that is pulling people away from seeing the humanity in death or in the disappearance, and that maybe is part of what the challenge of art right now is, to kind of renew. And this is a quote that I think is really important about what was directing your work, is this explosive, creative energy that truly puts itself on the side of life in the face of its annihilation, and that's part of what your work is trying to do, whether it's in the the analysis or in the artwork, the visual art.
I think there's, again, there's so much. One of the things I find interesting, and I think Mike's book really maps this out brilliantly, in a sense that for the last 2 decades, power has been moving more and more away from fixed notions of the body. All the while, critical theories become more and more embodied, right? So in that sense, power has long run ahead of the game, right? So, and identity politics, this idea that the closer you get to the body, the closer you get to theory. I think it's the complete opposite. The further away you get from the body, the closer you get to theory. But and that's what I think what Deleuze really meant by doing metaphysics instead of thinking metaphysics. So it's not about going closer to the body. It's on the contrary. And to give you an example of this, I think this idea of life, and this is not another abstraction in a sense where you look at the real realities of people who have a loved one who's disappeared. Yes, they want the body back, but what that person represents is far more than just the body. We are, in that sense, much more than human, and the way in which ideas of spectrality, and Chantal talks about memory, imagination, lived experience, all those things far exceed the body, and they can't be reduced to that. Now, you talk then about this link to I think necropolitics. I really like Achille's work, and I did a podcast with him around civil war. We had a great chat through this, but my only trouble sometimes with necropolitics, I understand where it was going, but it's still too embodied in many ways for me, and I think it does need to go perhaps go further in what it's trying to achieve, but linking it just back to the idea of I understand what might necropolitics mean in the absence of bodies, and I think that might be a different question. But just one final point in terms of fascism, I keep going back to Foucault's preface to Anti-Oedipus, and I think actually when people ever say Foucault never had a normative politics, I say just read this bloody introduction. It's as normative as you're going to get, But he's very clear, the fight against fascism is the fascism in our heads. That begins long before bodies, and I think the fascism of thought and what does it mean to have a fascist thought, and how can an abstract thought be turned into, or Deleuze's term, the line of flight? How does that become suicidal? And it feels like today we're all riding a suicidal wave. That everything is just leading us to our own inevitable ruination, and we desire it now. And all we're taught in the context of AI, this is our only salvation, right? Nothing else is going to save us. And you kind of think, well, okay, can we just get off a bit? Just take that time to think about it, because I think that's where we're in. This idea that we're all on suicidal lines of flight now, and it doesn't seem to be any way of jumping off it. And I think that's the danger we're in. So,
well, we were at an hour, so I don't really. I know like you said, we probably could talk for several more hours, but I know that part of what has brought you together, and in the intro to your book, we hear more about what brought Brad and Chantal together. I'm not sure how the collaboration with Mike began, but you are all working on this issue of the humanities that you're co-editing. So. Maybe I don't know if you want to say something about that issue, and maybe what you're looking for, and what brought you together.
Sure. There's what brought us together in the first place is at least for me, my admiration for both Brad and Chantal's work, and I cold called them and said, "Hey, would you be my friend?" And they said, "Well, sure, let's talk." And so here we are, and then that's led to a number of other.
And that's how you make friends, kids. Sometimes you got a cold call.
Sometimes you gotta go and just make a simple introduction. You don't know me, but I know you. Yeah, and so one of the things we're talking about was this special issue of a journal called Humanities, which I'm going to be special editing. I have a number of abstracts in place already, including some from Brad and maybe Chantal, but at least Chantal's work will be there in some form or another, referred to or actually there. And then there's a lot of other interesting people that have offered contributions. Tom Cohen, who works on Bernard Stiegler and techniques and climate change. Several other people, Imre Seisman over at Toronto. There's a whole group of people. There's an open call for abstracts. I'm really hoping people will write in and send a 250 word abstract, 300, whatever, over the next period, let's say the next month. So if we could get those abstracts wrapped up by September 1st, there is a link, I think, in your post to the actual speech.
Well, and we'll put that in the show notes, so it'll be below this video when it goes live. So
yeah, directly for other things like deadlines for the essays. We're not looking to get actual essays in hand until about March, so there's time.
Okay.
Right, but yeah, any dialogue by email or otherwise that we could do for an abstract and possible contribution, I'd love to encourage viewers and listeners to come on board.
Well, thanks to you all for joining us. And this is a really provocative and thought-provoking conversation. So thanks for being here, all of you, joining us on different sides of the world right now.
Thank you guys so much, and thanks, Brad and Chantal, for joining us here.
No, it was our pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sean, as well.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you. So next week, we'll be speaking with Marina Levina of the University of Memphis about the Anti-Authoritarian Research Network she's helping to manage, which aims to resist authoritarianism in all its forms while helping with critical partnerships and resources. So join us next week. That'll be, again, streaming on the YouTube channel. And it'll also be available on the YouTube channel recorded afterwards, just like this episode. So please share this episode with your colleagues and let us know if you have any ideas for future episodes by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. So thanks again for joining us. I'm Sean Johnson Andrews, and please check out my Substack, my other writing at breakingculture.substack.com.